"No, please, leave them in," the alien warrior cried, but the human soldier had no choice. The battle on Zilnar 6 was fierce, a grinding war that had stretched both sides to their breaking points. The planet, once lush and full of life, now lay scarred by the endless conflict between the human federation and the alien species known as the Raka. Every inch of ground was contested, and every battle seemed to take a little more from both sides. Sergeant Jack Riley, or Razor, as his fellow soldiers called him, had seen it all. A seasoned veteran of countless campaigns, he had learned the hard way that war was not just about strategy or strength, it was about survival. And survival often meant making choices that didn't sit well with anyone, least of all with him. It was on a mission like any other that Jack's squad found themselves in the heart of enemy territory. Their objective was clear: infiltrate a Raka stronghold and retrieve valuable intelligence that could shift the tide of the war. But as always in this war, things didn't go as planned. The team made their way through dense, alien jungle, the air thick with humidity and the scent of something strange. The landscape was unfamiliar, jagged hills rising sharply from the mist-covered ground, the trees towering above like silent giants. It wasn't the kind of place you'd ever want to be caught in, but here they were, on the ground and pushing forward with only the sound of their boots crunching through the undergrowth. "Keep it tight, everyone," Jack muttered into his calm. "We don't want any surprises." His voice, rough from years of commanding troops, made his men fall into line without question. They knew the drill by now: stay quiet, move fast, stay alive. The rest would come later. The mission was the mission. As they advanced deeper into the jungle, Jack's instincts tingled with the unease that always came before something went wrong. It wasn't the first time he'd felt it, and it wasn't the first time he'd ignored it. But today, that feeling wasn't just a passing doubt. It was the kind of warning that made you question everything. And then they found it. Lying in the mud, half hidden by vines, were several Raka warriors. They were unlike anything Jack had ever seen before, their greenish, scale-like skin slick with blood. The warrior closest to him, a woman, was on her knees, clutching her side, her breathing shallow. The blood pooling around her suggested she had been here for a while, suffering, and if not for their timely discovery, she would have surely died alone. For a moment, Jack didn't move. His eyes scanned the scene, no enemy soldiers around, no ambush waiting to spring. Just these wounded Raka, all alone in pain. He could hear the labored breaths of the female warrior as she raised her head, her eyes locking onto his. "Help," she rasped, her voice hoarse from pain. "Please, help." Jack froze. This wasn't what he had expected. The Raka were ruthless soldiers, known for their brutality and indifference to their enemies. They had fought tooth and nail against humanity, each battle leaving bodies on both sides. The idea of one of them, especially a warrior of such high rank, pleading for help was wrong. His eyes flicked to his squad, his face unreadable. "Form up." "Get her stable," he ordered, his voice firm, but inside he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. One of the soldiers, Private Daniels, knelt beside the wounded warrior, pulling out medical supplies. The Raka woman grimaced as Daniels worked quickly, attempting to stop the bleeding from her side. "Sergeant, she's bad, but I think we can stabilize her," Daniels said, looking up at Jack. Jack nodded, though something in his gut churned. There was no doubt in his mind that they were still behind enemy lines. Any one of these warriors could be a trap, an ambush waiting to happen, but he couldn't leave her here to die, not when she was asking for help. "Who did this to you?" Jack asked, kneeling beside her. He had learned to speak basic Raka phrases over the years, but even so, he was careful with his words. These creatures weren't the type to trust easily, if at all. The warrior's lips curled into a pained smile, though it was clear it took every ounce of her strength. "The Raka, my own people," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was disobedient." Jack's eyes narrowed. He had heard whispers of Raka soldiers being punished for failures, but he hadn't imagined it would go this far. "What do you mean, disobedient?" he pressed, though he was more confused than ever. She took a slow breath, her body trembling. "We are controlled," she said. "The biochips implanted in our bodies, they make us obey, or they kill us." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had heard rumors of such things, biochips that controlled Raka soldiers, but to hear it from one of their own was shocking. The thought of an enemy soldier forced to follow orders, even against her will, was something he hadn't fully understood until now. "Why are you telling me this?" Jack asked, his voice softening despite himself. She closed her eyes for a moment, the tears mixing with the dirt on her face. "Because I want to die free," she whispered. Jack's chest tightened. He wasn't sure what to do with her words. She had just admitted that she had turned against her own people, but was she telling the truth? Could she be trusted? "Sergeant," Daniels interrupted, his voice tense. "We've got company, Raqqa soldiers inbound." The situation had just gotten a whole lot worse. Jack didn't have time to contemplate the warriors' plea for freedom or the strange revelation about the biochips. They were behind enemy lines, and now there was no time to think. He had to act. "Gather her up," Jack barked, already moving into action. "We're pulling out now." The soldiers quickly gathered around the injured warrior, carefully lifting her. She winced in pain but didn't protest. She was too weak. Jack had no idea how long she had been suffering, but there was no time for sympathy now. They had to get back to their extraction point before the Raqqa arrived. As Jack led his squad through the dense jungle, his mind raced. Everything about this mission had gone wrong. The discovery of this Raqqa warrior, the shocking revelation about the biochips. And now the approaching enemy forces. It seemed as though the universe had thrown everything at them in one go. The jungle felt like it was closing in around them as the soldiers pushed forward, their breaths heavy in the humid air. But Jack couldn't shake the thought of the Raqqa warrior, the one who had pleaded for help, who had begged him to leave the biochips in her body. What had she meant by that? It didn't matter now. What mattered was getting out alive. And somehow, Jack knew that whatever happened next, this war had just become a whole lot more complicated. As Sergeant Jack Riley and his squad trudged through the thick jungle of Zilnar 6, the oppressive silence of the forest seemed to weigh heavily on them. The air was thick with humidity, the ground slick and uneven beneath their boots. Every step seemed to echo in the stillness, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. Zyra, the injured Raqqa warrior, was being carried on a makeshift stretcher by two of Jack's men, Private Daniels and Corporal Edwards. Her body was still weak from the wounds she had sustained in battle, but she was alive. Barely. The warrior's eyes fluttered open occasionally, her breath shallow and labored, but she said little. Each time she spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Jack couldn't stop thinking about what she had told him earlier. The biochips. They were implanted in Raqqa warriors to control them, to make them obey orders. It was a terrifying thought. To know that the enemies they fought against were not all acting of their own free will, but were, in fact, slaves to an unseen force that could destroy them at any moment. It made the war feel less like a battle between nations and more like a struggle for survival against a cruel system. The sounds of the jungle were growing louder as they neared their extraction point. Jack could feel the sweat trickling down his neck, and he knew they didn't have much time. The Raqqa were a persistent enemy, and they would not let their warriors fall so easily. Every minute they spent in this jungle was another minute closer to danger. "How much further, Sergeant?" Daniels asked, his voice low, eyes scanning the trees nervously. Jack didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on Zyra. The warrior's eyes were closed again, and her breathing had grown heavier. It was clear that the biochips had taken a toll on her body. Jack knew they had to get her to safety quickly, or they would lose her. "You think she'll survive?" Edwards asked, his voice filled with an uncertainty that Jack could hear even through his helmet. "She's tough," Jack replied, "but these biochips, if we don't get them out soon, she won't make it." The thought of that haunted him. Zyra had pleaded with them to leave the chips in her body, but Jack knew that without removing them, she wouldn't last long. The Raqqa had made it clear that these chips were designed to be both a tool of control and a death sentence. If a soldier was deemed weak or disobedient, the chips could be activated to cause excruciating pain or even death. But why had Zyra begged them not to remove them? Was she afraid of something worse? Jack didn't have time to dwell on it. They were nearing their extraction point, a small clearing where the Federation transport ship would be waiting. The faint whirring of the ship's engines could already be heard through the trees, a welcome sound after hours of marching through hostile terrain. As they reached the clearing, Jack's squad quickly set up a perimeter. They needed to secure the area before they could begin evacuating. Jack watched as Daniels and Edwards carefully laid Zyra down on the ground, the warrior groaning in pain as they adjusted her position. Jack crouched beside her, his gaze lingering on the strange, alien features of her face. Zyra had the typical Raqqa features, sharp, angular cheekbones, a wide, powerful jawline, and greenish, scaled skin. But there was something different about her. In her eyes, there was a flicker of humanity, a spark of life that Jack hadn't expected to see in someone who had fought against humanity for so long. "Zyra," Jack said, his voice gentle, "tell me why you didn't want me to remove the chips. What were you afraid of?" Zyra's eyes opened slowly, and she looked up at him, her face twisted in pain. "You don't understand," she rasped. "If you take them out, they'll know, they'll come for you, they'll come for all of you." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "Who will come for us?" She tried to sit up but winced, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. "The Raka," she whispered. "The ones in charge, they control everything. If you take the chips out, they'll mark you as an enemy. They'll kill you, and they'll kill me too." Jack clenched his jaw. He had heard rumors of how the Raka controlled their soldiers, but hearing it from Zyra gave it a terrifying weight. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her freedom and perhaps for the freedom of all those who had been enslaved by the Raka's cruel system. "You have a choice," she continued, her voice weak but steady. "You can save me, or you can save yourself. But if you remove those chips, they'll know. They'll come and they won't stop until we're all dead." Jack's mind raced. The thought of letting Zyra die after everything they had been through together was unthinkable. But if he removed the chips, would the Raka really come for them? Would they be hunted down like animals? "Jack, the transport's ready," Daniels called from the other side of the clearing, pulling Jack's attention back to the present. "We need to move now." Jack stood up, his hand still on Zyra's shoulder. He looked down at her, and for the first time he saw the full weight of her plea. She wasn't asking for mercy, she was asking for survival for both of them. But in the end, he knew he had to make a decision. "You'll be safe," Jack said, his voice firm though his mind was torn. "We'll get you out of here, Zyra, we'll figure it out." She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered, "you don't understand. It's not just the chips, it's everything, the war, the Raka. You have no idea what you're up against." Jack clenched his fist. He had no time to hear her out completely. The transport was waiting and the Raka would be closing in soon. "Stay with us," Jack said as he signaled to his men. "We're getting you out of here. Don't worry about the chips. We'll deal with them later." But deep down, Jack wasn't so sure. Zyra's warning echoed in his mind as they lifted her onto the transport. Whatever danger lay ahead, whatever secrets the Raka had buried, Jack knew this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the ship took off, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The chips, the bioweapons, the threat of an enemy coming for them, it was all part of something bigger, something darker than they had ever imagined. And Zyra, for all her strength and courage, was the key to it all. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The quiet hum of the Federation transport was the only sound as it cut through the thick atmosphere of Zilnar 6. Jack Riley sat in the cockpit, his fingers drumming absently on the console. His squad was seated in the cargo bay behind him, each lost in their own thoughts. Even Zyra, the injured Raka warrior, had fallen silent, her face pale against the dull glow of the ship's interior lights. They had been flying for hours now, far from the jungle and the battlefield, but Jack's mind was still stuck in the clearing where he had made the decision to save Zyra. It wasn't a decision he took lightly, and the weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. His instinct had told him to pull the biochips out of her to give her a chance at survival, but the warning she had given him rang in his ears. If they removed the chips, the Raka would come for them. They would come for all of them. Jack wasn't sure what was worse, Zyra's plea to leave the chips in her body, or the thought of the Raka military hunting them down. There was something in her eyes, something deep, that told him the stakes were higher than just the life of one warrior. It felt like a warning about something bigger, something more dangerous. The ship's engines thrummed steadily beneath him, and Jack let out a long breath. He had to focus. They had to get back to Federation space before the Raka could track them down, and more importantly, they needed to figure out what to do with Zyra. She wasn't just another prisoner or enemy soldier. They needed her knowledge. She knew things about the Raka that could turn the tide of the war, but it wasn't going to be easy. "Sergeant," Daniel's voice crackled over the comms, snapping Jack from his thoughts. "We're nearing the rendezvous point, the transport-S waiting to take us back to the base." Jack glanced out the cockpit window at the approaching starship, its sleek silhouette standing out against the backdrop of Zilnar 6's fading sky. They were almost home, but home wasn't safe, not anymore. He toggled the comms. "Understood, get ready, everyone. We'll be on the ground in 20 minutes. In the cargo bay, Zyra lay on one of the makeshift medical beds they had set up. Her face was still contorted with pain, but she was alive. For now. Jack had instructed the medics to monitor her condition, but the biochips were a constant concern. Every time they moved her, she winced in agony, the fear of the chips still looming over her like a dark cloud. Private Edwards sat next to her, keeping a close eye on the woman who, only hours ago, had been an enemy combatant. Jack had seen it all before, the enemy soldier begging for mercy, pleading for a chance at survival. But there was something different about Zyra. There was more to her story than just her status as a warrior. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity about her people. The Raka were ruthless, yes, but were they all like this? Were they all trapped by something they couldn't control? He had fought against them for years, but this was the first time he had truly seen a Raka warrior as something more than just an enemy to be eliminated. "She's still holding on," Edwards said, breaking Jack's train of thought. "But if we don't get those chips out, she's not going to make it." Jack nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I know, but it's more complicated than that." The rest of the squad remained silent, the weight of the situation pressing on all of them. They had saved Zyra, but what did that mean for them? What would happen when the Raka realized one of their own had betrayed them? As the ship continued its journey, Jack found himself replaying the conversation he had with Zyra in the jungle. The warning she had given him still echoed in his mind. The Raka were coming. But who were they, really? And what exactly had Zyra meant when she said they controlled everything? Was it just the chips, or was there something more sinister at play? Zyra stirred in her bed, her eyes opening slightly. Her gaze met Jack's, and for a moment they just looked at each other. There was no anger, no hatred in her eyes, just a deep, weary understanding. "You should have let me die," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's heart skipped a beat at her words. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, leaning closer. Zyra's lips twitched in what might have been a faint smile, though it was laced with pain. "If you had left me in the jungle, I would have died fighting, but now I have to live with this, with what I've become." Jack frowned, still trying to understand. "What's so bad about living?" She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath catching. "The Raka are not just warriors, Sergeant. We are tools, weapons. And when you become a weapon, you lose everything. You lose who you are, you lose your soul." Her words hung in the air, heavy and haunting. Jack didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure how to respond to someone who had seen war in such a way. Zyra wasn't just a soldier. She was a victim of a system that saw her as nothing more than an instrument of destruction. "I didn't ask for this," Zyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask to be made into a weapon, but that's what the Raka do to us. They take everything we are and twist it into something else, something they can control." Jack's stomach twisted at the thought. The Raka weren't just fighting for conquest. They were fighting for survival, and in doing so they had created a race of people who were little more than puppets. "But you're not like that," Jack said softly. "You fought back, you're different." Zyra's eyes flickered open again, and she met his gaze with a look of quiet despair. "Am I? Or have I just been fooling myself this whole time, fighting against a system that I'm already a part of?" Jack's mind raced. He had been trained to kill the enemy, to destroy whatever posed a threat. But now, standing in front of him was a soldier who had been forced into a life of violence, someone who had tried to break free but was still shackled by her past. He couldn't let her go like this. He couldn't let her believe that she was nothing more than a puppet. "You are more than what they made you," Jack said, his voice firm. "You don't have to be what they want you to be. You can choose who you are." Zyra was silent for a long time, as though she were considering his words. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Maybe," she whispered, "but it's not that easy." Before Jack could reply, the ship jolted, throwing him off balance. He gripped the console tightly, instinctively. The sudden motion was enough to make his heart race. "What was that?" Edwards asked from the back of the ship, his voice filled with alarm. Jack quickly checked the ship's systems, his fingers flying across the controls. The ship had taken a hit. A small explosion had rocked the rear section, and the alarm was blaring through the cockpit. "We're under attack," Jack shouted. "Everyone brace for impact." The ship lurched again, this time more violently, as if something had locked onto them. Jack's mind raced. He knew the Raka were relentless, but this was faster than he had anticipated. They had to be close, too close for comfort. He looked over his shoulder at Zyra. She was still lying there, weak and barely conscious, but something about her expression told him she knew exactly what was happening. "They've found us," she said softly. "I told you they would." The sound of Rocca fighters blasting through space filled the air as the ship shuddered again, and Jack's worst fears began to come true. The Federation transport shuddered again as another blast hit the ship's rear. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He quickly gripped the control panel, trying to stabilize the ship. The ship's hull groaned and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. "Rocca fighters," Jack muttered under his breath. The small fleet of sleek, deadly ships had caught up with them faster than expected. They were here. "Brace for impact," Jack barked into his comms. He quickly flipped switches, triggering the ship's defensive systems, but it was clear they were outmatched. The transport wasn't built for dogfights, and the Rocca knew it. "Sergeant, we can't outrun them," Daniel's voice came through tense. "We need to fight back." "We'll do what we can," Jack said through gritted teeth. The control panel blinked red, warning lights flashing. The ship was already taking more damage than Jack liked. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The ship jolted again, but this time it was different. There was a deeper, more forceful impact, followed by the sound of screeching metal as the shields cracked. Jack's hands moved instinctively, steering the transport left and right as best as he could to avoid the incoming fire. The Rocca fighters were relentless, circling them like predators closing in on their prey. The voices of his squad members were frantic, but Jack's focus was entirely on keeping the ship intact. He had no intention of losing any of them today, not after everything they had been through. "Zyra," Jack shouted, turning toward the cargo bay. "You need to hold on." Zyra, still lying on the bed, her face pale and tired, had barely stirred when the first blast hit. But now she opened her eyes, her breathing shallow but her gaze sharp. "Get me to a weapon," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with purpose. Jack hesitated for a second, then nodded. She was right. They couldn't just sit there and wait to be picked off. They had to fight. But the situation was dire. If they couldn't shake the fighters soon, the ship would be a sitting duck. "I'm not sure we have any weapons, but we'll figure something out," Jack replied, already heading toward the rear of the ship where the emergency armory was stored. The sounds of gunfire echoed throughout the ship, followed by the violent shake of another blast. He could feel the ship's structure creaking as it fought to stay intact. Zyra shifted on the medical bed, wincing in pain as she tried to sit up. She was weak, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. "I know the Rocca tactics." "I can help," she insisted, her voice strained. "You can't afford to waste time. You'll be dead before you even get a chance to fire back." Jack reached the armory, quickly pulling out 2 pulse rifles and handing one to Zyra. She grabbed it with surprising strength, despite the pain, and immediately set to work. Her movements were fluid and precise, the posture of a soldier who had fought countless battles. "You can shoot?" Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. Zyra glanced at him, her lips curling into a wry smile. "I was trained to kill." "Fair enough," Jack muttered. He grabbed a rifle for himself and moved toward the controls again. "Let's hope we can outlast these guys." Back in the cockpit, Jack's grip tightened on the control panel as the Rocca fighters closed in. He knew that if they didn't break free of their current trajectory, they would be sitting ducks in no time. But there was something else he had to think about: the life of his crew and the alien warrior they had just rescued. Zyra's warning echoed in his mind. If the Rocca knew they had taken her, they would stop at nothing to get her back. And if they came for her, they would come for them all. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was surviving, and that meant fighting back with everything they had. "Stay on course," Jack shouted. "Do not let them get a lock on us." The ship shuddered again, this time a deeper tremor. A warning flashed on the control panel, and Jack cursed under his breath. The shields were failing. They were running out of time. Zyra appeared behind him, steadying herself with one hand on the wall and the other gripping her pulse rifle. "I can disable their engines," she said, her voice low, "but we have to get closer." Jack looked at her, weighing his options. It was risky, but they didn't have many choices left. "Do it," he said, his jaw clenched. Zyra moved quickly, taking her position at one of the ship's secondary consoles. She worked with a level of ease and skill that Jack hadn't expected. As a Rocca warrior, she had to know their technology better than anyone. If anyone could get them out of this mess, it was her. Jack quickly changed course, diving the ship into a series of sharp, evasive maneuvers. The Rocca fighters were relentless, but Jack's years of combat experience helped him keep the ship just out of their deadly reach. He could see the fighters closing in, their guns trained on them, ready to strike. "Almost there," Zyra's voice came through, steady despite the chaos around her. I just need another 10 seconds. Jack gritted his teeth and held the ship steady, taking it as low as he could to the surface of the planet. He hoped the rocket would follow them into the atmosphere. It would give them some cover. Suddenly, the ship lurched to the side as another blast hit their shields. This time, they failed to hold and sparks flew from the panel in front of Jack. The transport groaned in protest as the outer hull began to buckle under the pressure. Jack's knuckles turned white as he gripped the controls even harder, trying to keep the ship from breaking apart. "Zyra, hurry up!" Jack shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "I'm doing everything I can," she snapped back, her fingers flying over the console. In the chaos, Jack could hear the sound of the Rocca fighters screeching past them, but it wasn't enough. The enemy was closing in. They had to act fast. Then, just as Jack thought it was all over, the console before him beeped, signaling an incoming transmission. A voice crackled through the comms. "Federation transport, you are surrounded. Power down your systems and prepare to be boarded." Jack's heart sank. They were trapped. "Zyra," he called, looking back over his shoulder. "What's your status?" Zyra's eyes were focused, and for the first time since the battle had started, there was a look of determination on her face. "Give me one more second." The Rocca fighters were closing in fast, and Jack knew they didn't have much time. He was about to make a desperate move, but before he could act, Zyra's fingers hit the final key, and the transport suddenly jolted forward. "Done," she said, her voice steady, but a hint of exhaustion lacing her words. Jack barely had time to process what had happened before he saw it. The Rocca fighters were now tumbling out of control, their engines disabled, and the ships careened into the atmosphere of Zilnar 6, their lights flickering as they crashed into the jungle below. "We're free," Jack breathed, the relief almost overwhelming, but they weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. Zyra staggered back to the cockpit, her face pale but resolute. "We have a little time before they send reinforcements," she said, her voice low. "We need to go now?" Jack nodded, quickly recalibrating their course to the Federation's nearest base. They had survived this fight, but Jack knew that the war was far from over, and now, with Zyra's help, it had only become more complicated. There was no going back. They had to keep moving forward. The Rocca would stop at nothing to get Zyra back, and the Federation would need every ally they could find. The stakes had just been raised, and Jack was ready to fight, no matter what it took. The Federation transport broke through the atmosphere of Zilnar 6, the planet's reddish-brown clouds swirling beneath them. Jack Riley's grip on the controls tightened as they ascended, the ship groaning under the stress. The last few minutes had been a blur, dodging Rocca fighters, narrowly escaping an ambush, and finally managing to disable their pursuers. But none of it mattered now. The fight wasn't over. "Status report," Jack shouted, his eyes darting between the controls and the ship's dwindling power reserves. They demated out of the immediate danger, but the ship was far from stable. He could feel the thrum of the engines struggling to keep the ship airborne. "Shields are down to 20%, Daniels responded from the back. "We've got multiple hull breaches in the rear section. We need to land and patch up or we won't make it." Jack nodded grimly. They didn't have a choice. The Federation's closest base was only 30 minutes away, but the ship's damage made it a race against time. "Zyra, how are you holding up?" Jack called, turning to where the Rocca warrior was sitting beside the emergency console. She had barely spoken since they escaped the Rocca fighters, and Jack couldn't blame her. The battle had taken a toll on her, both physically and mentally. Zyra's face was pale, her body slumped against the bulkhead. She looked up at him, her eyes full of exhaustion, but there was a quiet strength behind them. "I'm still breathing," she replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "I've been through worse," Jack frowned. Zyra wasn't just any soldier. She was a warrior, trained to survive the impossible. But she had fought her own people, survived an ordeal with the biochips, and now she was caught between two sides of a war she no longer knew how to navigate. Her strength, while impressive, didn't erase the confusion and guilt that seemed to cloud her every thought. "We've got about 10 minutes, Daniel said, his voice tense. "If we don't land soon, we'll be in serious trouble." Jack took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't used to feeling like a passenger in his own ship, but in this moment he had no control over the damage. They needed a safe place to land, and they needed it fast. As they neared the Federation base, the surrounding landscape came into view. The once vibrant forests of Zilnar 6 had been scorched by years of war, leaving behind a barren, rocky wasteland. It was a reminder of the cost of the ongoing conflict. Jack's eyes scanned the ground below, searching for the safest place to make an emergency landing. There, he said, pointing toward a flat area between two rocky outcrops. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He yanked the controls, steering the ship toward the landing zone. The ship groaned as it descended, the hull creaking under the strain. Jack gritted his teeth, praying they would make it down safely. The Rocca would be regrouping, sending more fighters after them. They couldn't afford to be caught out here. The landing was rough. The transport skidded across the rocky terrain, scraping the underbelly of the ship against the jagged ground. Jack's heart raced as the ship bounced, the impact jarring through his body. The lights flickered, and the sound of the ship's engines sputtering made his stomach twist. Finally, with a violent shake, the transport came to a halt. Jack exhaled sharply, his body tense with adrenaline. They had landed barely. The ship was crippled, but it was still intact. "We're down," Jack said, unbuckling himself from the pilot's seat. "Everyone, check in. Daniels, Edwards, I need you both to assess the damage. Zyra, stay here." Zyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to tell me what to do, I'm fine." Jack paused for a moment. He could see the determination in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a weariness that made him hesitate. She was a soldier, but she was also a person, and right now, she was as vulnerable as any of them. "I need you to stay safe," Jack said, his voice softening. "We can't afford to lose you, not now." Zyra nodded silently, not bothering to argue. There was no strength in her to resist. Instead, she sat back against the wall, her hand resting on the pulse rifle she'd been using earlier. Her eyes closed briefly, but Jack knew she was more aware of the situation than anyone else. Despite the weariness, she was still alert, her mind racing. Jack joined Daniels and Edwards in the rear of the ship, moving swiftly to assess the damage. The rear section had taken the worst of the hits, with several structural breaches exposing the interior to the harsh atmosphere outside. The ship was still pressurized, but the systems were unstable. It would take hours, if not days, to repair properly. "We've got fuel leaks in the aft, and the navigation system is shot," Daniels reported, his face grim. "I can make some temporary fixes, but this ship is in no condition to fly anywhere." Jack cursed under his breath. "How long until we're fully grounded?" "Maybe an hour, but I'm not sure how much longer we can stay sealed off from the outside," Daniels replied. "The ship's integrity is compromised. We need to get off this rock." Jack turned to Edwards, his mind already working through the next steps. "Gather what supplies you can." "We need to get to the base, and fast." Edwards nodded, quickly heading toward the storage compartments. Jack stood there for a moment, his thoughts running wild. They had survived the fight with the Rocca, but now they were stranded, with limited resources and no clear plan of escape. Zyra's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're going to leave me behind, aren't you?" Jack turned to face her, surprised by the bitterness in her tone. She had been so quiet after the landing, but now there was a fire in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "You don't trust me," Zyra continued, her voice hard. "You think I'm a liability. You think I'm just another Rocca warrior who'll turn on you the moment it's convenient." Jack shook his head. "That's not what I—" "Then what is it?" She cut him off, her frustration evident. "You saved my life, but you don't think I can pull my weight. You think I'll betray you just like my people betrayed me." Jack exhaled sharply, stepping closer to her. "You think I don't understand what you're going through? I get it, Zyra, this war. It's more than just about fighting, it's about survival, and I'm trying to keep us all alive. I'm not leaving anyone behind, least of all you." For a moment there was silence between them. Zyra looked at him, her gaze softening slightly. Then, without a word, she stood up and moved toward the emergency pack. "Then let's go," she said, her voice no longer filled with anger but determination. "We don't have much time." Jack watched her for a moment, then nodded. The tension between them hadn't entirely disappeared, but there was a sense of understanding now. They both had their burdens to bear, but for the first time, Jack felt like they were working toward the same goal. The squad began to gather what little they could carry. Their time on Zilnar 6 had been brief, but it had changed everything. Zyra was no longer just an enemy soldier, had fought side by side, and in doing so they had forged an unlikely bond. As they prepared to leave the ship, Jack took one last look at the wrecked transport. The Rocca would be looking for them, and soon. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. "We'll make it," Jack said, his voice filled with conviction. "We've come this far, we're not going to stop now." Zyra gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't speak, but Jack could see it in her eyes. She wasn't going to stop either. They had both crossed too many lines to turn back now. Together, they would survive, no matter what it took. As the team moved toward the Federation base, the sounds of the war outside faded into the background. There were no guarantees, no promises of safety. But one thing was certain, this war wasn't over. And no matter where it took them, Jack and Zyra would face it together.